In the winter of 1857, four women vanished from a remote Mormon settlement in the Utah Territory without leaving a single footprint in the snow. Their husband, Ezekiel Whitmore, claimed they had set out to visit family back east, an impossible journey during the most brutal winter the territory had ever seen. For more than 60 years, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints kept the incident locked away in their private archives. But in 1920, construction workers building a new meeting house made a discovery that forced church leaders to confront one of the darkest chapters in early Utah history. What they uncovered beneath the chapel's foundation would shake the faith of an entire community, challenging everything they believe about family, faith, and the price of building Zion in the wilderness. Before we continue with the story of Ezekiel Whitmore and the winter that changed everything, remember, this channel isn't for everyone. It's for those brave enough to uncover the mysteries history tried to bury. If you're ready to hear stories that make you question what really happened in America's past, hit subscribe, ring the bell, and tell me in the comments what state you're listening from. Are you brave enough to face the truth about the early Mormon settlements? Let's find out together. Because what was discovered in 1920 proved one thing: some secrets are too terrible to stay buried. The Utah Territory of 1847 was a place of impossible dreams and crushing realities. When Brigham Young first gazed upon the Salt Lake Valley and declared, "This is the place," he was looking at thousands of square miles of harsh, alkaline desert, ringed by mountains that could trap settlers in complete isolation for months at a time. Yet, for the Mormon pioneers, this desolation was providence, a promised land where they could practice their faith free from the persecution that had driven them from Missouri, Illinois, and everywhere else they tried to call home. Ezekiel Whitmore arrived during the second wave of Mormon migration in late September of 1847. Unlike the advance company that traveled with Brigham Young, Whitmore's group faced the coming winter with too few supplies and inadequate shelter. He was 34 years old, a skilled carpenter from Vermont who had converted to Mormonism in 1843 after hearing Joseph Smith speak in Nauvoo. What set Whitmore apart from most of his fellow pioneers was his family. He traveled with 4 wives, all legally married to him under the church's then secret practice of plural marriage. His first wife, Sarah, was 31, a steady woman with graying hair who had been married to Ezekiel for 8 years. She was barren, a fact that, under Mormon theology, made plural marriage not just acceptable but necessary for achieving the highest degree of celestial glory. It was Sarah who had chosen Rebecca Thornton, 27, as Ezekiel's second wife in 1845. Rebecca was educated, unusual for a woman of her time, and could read both English and German. She questioned church doctrine more openly than most men were comfortable with. But Ezekiel valued her sharp mind and the debate she brought to their family discussions. Mary Kellerman became the third wife in early 1847, just before the journey west. At 24, she was pregnant with her first child and suffered greatly during the trek across the plains. Her German immigrant parents had died during the Nauvoo period, leaving her with no family outside the Whitmore household. The fourth wife, Ruth Caldwell, was barely 19. She joined the family only 3 months before their departure for Utah, in a marriage arranged by church elders who believed she needed protection after losing her own family in the Missouri conflicts. The Whitmore family eventually settled in what would later be called Mill Creek, about 8 miles southeast of Salt Lake City. Ezekiel chose a location for its year-round water supply, promising farmland, and, perhaps most importantly, its isolation. He had always been a private man, preferring the company of his wives and his carpentry work to the social demands of community life. That first autumn, Ezekiel worked with relentless focus to prepare for the winter. He built a large log cabin with separate rooms for each wife, following the careful protocols Mormon men use to maintain order in plural households. The cabin was well constructed with thick log walls and a stone foundation, but it was the only building for miles. Their nearest neighbors were a Danish convert family 3 miles north, who would become unreachable once the heavy snows began. In those early years, the Mormon community was tightly bound by necessity. Survival depended on cooperation, shared resources, and mutual support. Church leaders kept strict oversight of plural marriages, not only for theological reasons, but also because managing such families in isolation was fraught with challenges. Each of Ezekiel's wives brought a vital skill to the household. Sarah ran the home with quiet efficiency, overseeing food storage and textile production. Rebecca kept meticulous records of supplies and expenses, and taught herself basic medical skills that could be life-saving in an emergency. Mary, despite her pregnancy, preserved fruits and vegetables for winter. And Ruth, the youngest, was full of energy, taking on the hardest labor despite her small frame. By December 1847, the Whitmore family appeared to be thriving. Church records show Ezekiel made regular trips into the settlement to trade goods and attend meetings. Visitors described his wives as healthy, well-dressed, and unusually harmonious for a plural family. Bishop William Curtis, who visited in early December, later wrote in his journal that the Whitmore household seemed blessed with uncommon unity and prosperity, a sign, he said, of righteous living. But what Bishop Curtis didn't include in his official report, only in his private diary, was something that unsettled him. The four women seemed too harmonious. They finished each other's sentences, moved in eerie synchronization, and, he wrote, reminded him of a single mind inhabiting four bodies. He also noted they all had similar marks on their wrists, small, deliberate, cuts they claimed came from kitchen accidents, but all looked to be the same age and depth. The winter of 1847 to 1848 was brutal, even by Utah standards. Snow began falling in mid-November and did not relent until March. Temperatures plummeted to 20 below zero more than once, and the wind roared across the valley with such force that it could knock a grown man off his feet. For families living in the main settlement, the winter was hard but survivable. For isolated families like the Whitmores, it became a trial of preparation, faith, and sheer endurance. The last confirmed sighting of all four Whitmore women together came on December 19, 1847, when a group of hunters from the main settlement passed by the cabin. They saw smoke rising from the chimney and spoke briefly with Sarah and Rebecca, who accepted a gift of fresh venison. The women thanked them but politely declined an invitation to attend Christmas services in town, saying they planned to hold their own worship at home. What happened after that would puzzle investigators for decades and grow into one of the most haunting mysteries in early Mormon history. The first sign something was wrong came on January 8, 1848, when Ezekiel Whitmore appeared in the main settlement asking to speak privately with Bishop Curtis. Those who saw him that day said he looked as if he had aged years in just 3 weeks. His clothes were disheveled, his beard unkempt, and his eyes are what one witness described as the look of a man who had seen too much. Behind closed doors, Ezekiel told the bishop that his wife Sarah had received a divine revelation commanding her to travel east to care for her sick sister in Missouri. The calling, he said, was so urgent that she had left immediately, joining a small group of travelers passing through the area. Bishop Curtis was skeptical. No one in their right mind would attempt an eastward journey in the dead of winter, and Sarah had never mentioned having a sister in Missouri. When the bishop pressed for details, Ezekiel's story began to shift. First, the travelers were missionaries heading back east. Then, they were mountain men who knew secret winter routes. Witnesses said Ezekiel's hands trembled as he spoke, and he kept glancing toward the cabin door, as though he feared someone might overhear. Most alarming of all, he insisted the bishop not visit the cabin, claiming the remaining wives were undergoing a period of spiritual purification that required total isolation. Bishop Curtis dutifully recorded the conversation in his official journal, but in his private diary, his words were darker. Brother Whitmore speaks of revelations, he wrote. By fear he hides something far more earthly and terrible. His manner suggests guilt rather than grief. His explanations contradict both reason and the season. 3 weeks later, on January 30th, Ezekiel returned to the settlement with even more disturbing news. Rebecca, he claimed, had also received a divine calling, this time to teach at a mission school in the East, and had departed with another passing group of travelers. The bishop demanded to know what travelers could possibly be moving through Utah in February. Ezekiel's response was rambling, almost incoherent, filled with talk of God's mysterious ways and the trials of faith. This time, Bishop Curtis insisted on visiting the cabin himself to check on the remaining wives. Ezekiel became agitated, claiming that Mary and Ruth were ill with fever that could be contagious. He promised to bring them to the settlement once they recovered, but the bishop's suspicions were too great to ignore. On February 3rd, Bishop Curtis organized a party of 5 men and set out for the Whitmore homestead. The journey through the snow-covered hills took most of the day despite the short distance. When they arrived, they found Ezekiel alone, sitting by a fire too small to heat the entire cabin. He greeted them with nervous politeness, but his story had changed again. Now, he claimed Mary and Ruth had both recovered from their illness and had chosen to follow Sarah and Rebecca east, leaving just 2 days earlier with a group of trappers who had promised safe passage. When the bishop asked to see the women's belongings, Ezekiel led them through several rooms that appeared to have been hastily cleared out. Clothing, books, and personal items were gone, but heavy furniture and cooking implements remained, odd for women supposedly making a permanent departure. More troubling were the signs of recent digging behind the cabin. Ezekiel explained that he was expanding the root cellar in preparation for next winter, but the ground was frozen solid, and the amount of disturbed earth seemed far too large for simple food storage. When one of the men commented on how difficult it would be to dig that much in frozen ground, Ezekiel snapped back, saying that God's work required dedication even in the hardest conditions. The men stayed overnight at the cabin, and several later reported feeling deeply uneasy. The house was too quiet. No rustle of skirts, no soft conversations, none of the ordinary sound of women tending a home. The meal Ezekiel served them consisted only of preserved foods, though fresh bread and dairy should have been available if women had been running the household recently. Most disturbing of all was an incident during the night. Thomas Garrett, one of the visitors, was awakened by the sound of faint weeping, coming, he swore, from somewhere beneath the cabin. In the morning, when he mentioned it to the others, they dismissed it as wind or creaking timbers. But Garrett remained convinced he had heard human voices in distress. The bishop's party left the next morning with more questions than answers. In his private diary, Bishop Curtis wrote, "I fear Brother Whitmore may have committed acts that will bring shame upon our people and our faith. The isolation of winter can drive men to desperate measures, and I fear the pressures of plural marriage may have proven too great for his spirit to bear." Bishop Curtis faced a terrible dilemma. The Mormon community was already under scrutiny from the federal government, and rumors of violence or impropriety could draw dangerous attention from authorities. Plural marriage itself was controversial, and any scandal involving a polygamous household could be used as justification for government intervention in church affairs. After consulting with other church leaders, Bishop Curtis chose to monitor the situation quietly, hoping that the coming spring would bring clarity or resolution. Throughout the remaining winter months, Ezekiel appeared regularly in the settlement, always alone, looking thinner and more haggard with each visit. He claimed to receive letters from his wives, saying they had safely arrived in the East and were happy in their new circumstances. But when pressed, he could never produce the letters. He would say they were too personal to share, or that they had been accidentally destroyed in the fire. Whispers began to spread through the community. Some believed Ezekiel had truly sent his wives away, perhaps because he could no longer support them, or because tensions in the isolated household had grown unbearable. Others suspected something far darker, pointing to his erratic behavior and the inconsistencies in his stories. The truth remained hidden until spring revealed what the snow had concealed. When the thaw finally came in April of 1848, Bishop Curtis gathered a small group and traveled once more to the Whitmore homestead. What he discovered would haunt him for the rest of his life. The cabin appeared to have been abandoned for weeks. A thick layer of dust coated the furniture, and the rooms that had belonged to the 4 wives showed signs of hurried cleaning rather than normal departure. Then, the bishop found the first piece of damning evidence. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Rebecca's room was her leather-bound journal, the one she had faithfully kept since joining the family. The final entry, dated December 20th, 1847, was written in a shaky, almost desperate hand. "He says we must all make the ultimate sacrifice for the sake of the eternal family," she wrote. "But I fear his revelations come from a darker source than heaven." Behind the cabin, the area Ezekiel had claimed to be expanding for a root cellar told an even grimmer story. The disturbed ground covered far more space than necessary for food storage, and the digging had been done in stages over several weeks. The bishop and his men began to dig. What they uncovered was worse than anyone had imagined. Fragments of fabric matching the clothing the women had been wearing, personal items including the wedding ring Sarah had worn since her marriage, and signs of some kind of ritual activity. In a nearby clearing, they found the remains of multiple fires arranged in a deliberate pattern. Mixed with the ashes were charred fragments of paper, pages torn from religious texts, but not from any official Mormon publications. Some of the still legible phrases spoke of blood atonement and eternal sealing through sacrifice. Inside the cabin, a final discovery removed all doubt. Hidden in a compartment in Ezekiel and Sarah's room were several notebooks filled with Ezekiel's handwriting. The pages documented his descent into religious obsession. He wrote of something he called the principle of ultimate consecration, the belief that God demanded the faithful surrender everything, even life itself, to reach the highest degree of celestial glory. As the entries progressed, Ezekiel's handwriting grew more erratic, his words more frenzied. He claimed to have been chosen for a divine mission, that his wives had been sent to him for a purpose, and that only through their willing offering could the eternal family be sealed forever. The last pages reference innocence and the power of shed blood, phrases that left Bishop Curtis shaken to his core. There was little doubt left. The evidence suggested Ezekiel had murdered his 4 wives, likely as part of a twisted ritual he believed was commanded by God. But Ezekiel himself was gone, vanished. Despite weeks of searching, no trace of him was ever found. The wilderness had swallowed him whole. Faced with a potential scandal, church leadership made a grim decision. The entire incident would be classified as confidential. The truth, they believed, could destroy the fragile community and invite federal intervention that might shatter the church entirely. The official records were sealed. The few men who knew the full story were sworn to secrecy. The Whitmore cabin was quietly dismantled, and the ground behind it carefully restored. The church purchased the property and declared it unsuitable for settlement, ensuring no one would stumble upon whatever might still be buried there. Officially, the 4 wives were recorded as having relocated to the east, their disappearance explained away as a family decision to return to more settled lands. But secrets have a way of surviving. Over the years, whispered stories circulated to the valley of the winter when 4 women vanished, and a man's faith led him to commit unspeakable acts. Some claimed Ezekiel had gone mad from isolation and religious mania. Others suggested he had discovered something in the valley, something not of this world, that had demanded a terrible price for his family's survival. And then there were the most persistent rumors, the ones that said Ezekiel had not acted alone. Some believed the 4 women had willingly taken part in whatever ritual ended their lives. Convinced by their husbands' claims of divine revelation, they believed their sacrifice was essential for eternal salvation. This interpretation was especially unsettling. It suggested that the tragedy was not just a result of one man's madness, but a shared delusion. As the decades passed, the former Whitmore property developed a grim reputation. Travelers claimed they felt watched when passing through the valley. Some even swore they heard women's voices whispering on the wind, especially during the long, cold winters. Church leaders dismissed these stories as superstition, but the sense of darkness around the site lingered. The mystery might have stayed buried forever if not for the church's rapid growth and its need for new buildings to serve the expanding congregation. In 1920, more than 70 years after the disappearances, church authorities chose the Mill Creek area for a new meeting house. The location was ideal: flat, central, and perfect for construction. But no one realized that beneath the soil lay a secret that would force the church to confront one of its most carefully hidden chapters. Construction began on a crisp October morning. The supervisor, Brother Samuel Morrison, had grown up hearing whispers about the Whitmore tragedy, though he dismissed them as exaggerated folklore. The first 2 days passed uneventfully. Only a few rusty horseshoes and metal scraps turned up in the rocky soil. On the third day, everything changed. About 4 feet below the surface, the crew uncovered a carefully constructed stone chamber, 8 feet square, sealed with a flat stone cover. Inside was a chilling discovery. For neatly arranged piles of women's clothing, each set complete with dress, undergarments, shoes, and small personal items like combs, mirrors, and jewelry. Each pile also contained a leather purse with identification papers, unmistakably belonging to Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, and Ruth Whitmore. The items had been perfectly preserved by the dry air and stone enclosure, as though frozen in time. Brother Morrison immediately halted construction and called Bishop Harold Stevenson, who in turn notified church headquarters in Salt Lake City. Within hours, a team of high-ranking officials arrived, led by Elder James Tanner, the Quorum of the 12. Tanner's review of the documents confirmed what church leaders had quietly feared for generations. Among the objects were farewell letters from each wife, written shortly before their deaths. Sarah's letter was calm, almost reverent, thanking God for choosing her for this final sealing ordinance. Rebecca's letter was longer, filled with obscure theological references and her belief that the shedding of righteous blood would open the doors of celestial glory. Mary's was the most heartbreaking. She spoke of her unborn child and her faith that their double sacrifice would be counted as a double blessing. Ruth's short note expressed love for her family and joy at joining them in the eternal world. The letters revealed a disturbing truth. The women had not been murdered against their will. They had chosen to die, persuaded that their deaths were a sacred offering. Elder Tanner immediately halted all construction and ordered a review of the church's sealed archives. What they found added even more weight to the tragedy. Bishop Curtis's original investigation notes contained evidence that suggested the Whitmore incident might not have been an isolated case. Ezekiel's notebooks mention correspondence with other Mormon men who claimed to have received similar revelations, visions of ultimate sacrifice as the highest act of faith. Most chilling of all was a letter Bishop Curtis had intercepted in 1849, addressed to Ezekiel at a remote Nevada mining camp. Signed only with the initials JAM, it congratulated him on the completion of the work and hinted that others have fulfilled the same calling with equal devotion. This discovery suggested that Ezekiel was not alone, that there may have been others scattered across the frontier who carried out similar rituals in secret. It soon became clear that Ezekiel had not been acting alone. Evidence suggested he was part of a secret group within the early Mormon community, men who had taken church doctrine to dangerous extremes. This clandestine circle believed that the highest expression of faith was the sacrifice of one's own family, and that such offerings would guarantee exaltation in the celestial kingdom. Elder Tanner's team began combing through early church records, searching for other unexplained disappearances. What they uncovered was chilling. Between 1847 and 1855, at least a dozen Mormon families had reported the sudden departure of wives or children under suspiciously similar circumstances. Each time, surviving husbands or fathers claimed divine revelations had sent their loved ones east or on distant missions. Viewed individually, these cases had seemed unremarkable, but put together, they formed a disturbing pattern. A network of men who appeared to be carrying out what they believed were sacred killings. The victims were nearly always women and children. The perpetrators? Devout, respected men, often community leaders, who exchanged letters filled with elaborate theological justifications for their acts. Their writings revealed a complex, secret doctrine, an evolution of plural marriage into what they called the higher law. They believed that complete consecration to God could only be achieved through the ultimate sacrifice, giving up the lives of those they loved most. They considered themselves pioneers of a new spiritual frontier, convinced that one day, all faithful Mormons would be called to make the same offering. As the investigation deepened, Tanner and his team realized this was no small cult. The group had been widespread, involving prominent church members across the Utah Territory. By the mid-1850s, church leaders had secretly discovered the existence of this faction and carried out a quiet purge, removing its members from leadership roles and forcing others to flee. None of this had ever been made public, but the Mill Creek discovery proved that this group's activities had been far more extensive than the church had ever admitted. The stone chamber's careful construction and preservation suggested that these rituals were seen as sacred ordinances, meant to be remembered for generations. The question that haunted Elder Tanner was simple but terrifying. Had the secret group truly been eliminated, or had some members escaped, continuing their dark mission in the remote corners of the frontier? The excavations at Mill Creek soon revealed that the chamber containing the women's clothing was only the beginning. Beneath it lay a second, larger chamber carved directly into the bedrock, 12 feet square, 6 feet deep, with carefully designed drainage channels that kept it perfectly dry for over 70 years. The walls were covered in intricate carvings, Mormon temple symbols blended with Egyptian hieroglyphs, Masonic emblems, and depictions of ancient sacrifice rituals. The centerpiece was a granite altar, rough-hewn but unmistakably sacred in design, its surface stained with human blood. Surrounding it were 4 smaller stone platforms, each inscribed with a wife's name: Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, and Ruth, along with dates from the winter of 1847 to 1848. Passages from Scripture were carved around the chamber, twisted to justify the taking of human life. Above the altar, one haunting inscription read, "Greater love hath no man than this, that a man laid down his life for his friends, and greater still is the love that lays down the lives of the beloved for the glory of God." When the team began excavating beneath the stone platforms, they made their most shocking discovery yet. Each platform concealed a carefully prepared burial site. Beneath the stone platforms lay the most disturbing discovery of all: the preserved remains of Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, and Ruth. Their bodies have been carefully mummified using materials and techniques suggesting a deep knowledge of preservation, possibly influenced by early Mormon fascination with Egyptian culture. The remains revealed chilling details. Each woman had been killed by a single, precise wound to the heart, inflicted with what appeared to be a ceremonial blade. The wounds were identical in depth and placement. This was no act of passion, but a carefully executed ritual. Even more unsettled was the fact that the women had been dressed in specially prepared ceremonial garments, elaborate white robes decorated with religious symbols and personal tokens. These were not victims of random violence. They had been ready for what the perpetrators saw as a sacred ordinance. Carved stone tablets found around the chamber provided a minute-by-minute record of the ceremonies. They included the women's final words, expressions of faith and gratitude for being chosen to achieve eternal glory through ultimate sacrifice. The tablets also mentioned the great work of the group, suggesting the Whitmore deaths were part of a much larger plan involving multiple families. The design of the chamber told its own story. It had been built for repeated use, with drainage channels, preparation areas, and storage for ritual garments and implements. This was no one-time crime scene, but a permanent ceremonial center. And the records proved it. At least 8 additional victims from 3 other missing families had been interred here between 1848 and 1855. Elder Tanner and his team were staring at evidence of a nearly decade-long campaign of ritual killings, carried out by a secret group hidden within the early church. They had not only justified their actions through scripture, they had documented them with meticulous care, as though creating a sacred history of their own. Among the records were lists of future candidates and detailed plans to expand the practice into other settlements. Even worse, the evidence revealed that some members of this group had held positions of authority within the church itself, using their influence to select victims and hide their crimes. This was no rogue act. It had been a systematic, organized conspiracy. The situation had become critical. Elder Tanner immediately reported his findings to the First Presidency, knowing that the decision they were about to make would determine whether this dark chapter history would finally be revealed. or buried forever to protect the faith from scandal and persecution. But the deepest secrets of Mill Creek were still waiting to be uncovered. During the final phase of the excavation, Tanner's team discovered a narrow, hidden passage behind a false wall. It led to a deeper chamber, a smaller but even more carefully built space. The stonework was perfect, the arches precise, the walls covered in intricate religious carvings. This was clearly the inner sanctum, the heart of the secret society. At its center stood a masterfully carved stone table. Its surface was etched with detailed maps of the Utah Territory, each Mormon settlement marked, along with notes about which households were considered worthy of the sacrifice. But the most shocking discovery was a set of stone tablets that contained the complete theology of the group, their entire belief system carved permanently in stone. These tablets revealed that the group had been led by a man named Jeremiah Blackwood, a zealot who claimed he had received direct revelation from Joseph Smith himself. These supposed revelations commanded him to form what he called the Order of Eternal Sacrifice. According to the tablets, Blackwood had attended some of Joseph Smith's private meetings in Nauvoo and twisted the prophet's teachings about eternal families and celestial marriage into something far more extreme. Blackwood believed that the ultimate test of faith required a family to sacrifice everything, including their own lives, as proof of their devotion to God and their worthiness for exaltation. The tablets outlined exactly how families were to be chosen for participation in the order's ceremonies. The ideal candidates were devout, lived in remote locations, and wouldn't be missed if they suddenly vanished. Polygamous families were often targeted since their absences were easier to explain away. It was during the harsh winter of 1846-47 that Ezekiel Whitmore was slowly drawn into the order. Blackwood had seen him as a perfect recruit, deeply religious, somewhat reclusive, and married to 4 women who had no close relatives in the Mormon community. Over months, Blackwood fed Ezekiel secret revelations, each one more extreme than the last, until Ezekiel was fully indoctrinated and committed to sacrificing his wives after the family's arrival in Utah. The tablets detailed how this horrific plan unfolded. Beginning on December 20th, 1847, Sarah was the first to volunteer, believing her death would guarantee eternal glory for her entire family. Over the next 2 months, Rebecca, Mary, and finally Ruth followed, with Ruth's death taking place on February 15, 1848. Each wife's final days were carefully recorded. They spent time in prayer, wrote farewell letters, and even prepared their burial robes, believing they were performing a holy ordinance revealed directly by God. Most disturbing of all, the tablets show that the women had not been forced. They had encouraged each other, building up their faith and eagerly anticipating what they believed would be their eternal reward. But the Whitmores were not the only family. The tablets contained lists of dozens of additional households targeted for recruitment, as well as plans to build more ritual chambers across the Western Territories. The order fully expected that their practices would one day be recognized as official doctrine, a mandatory step for those seeking the highest degree of celestial glory. The records also revealed why the order's activities suddenly stopped in the mid-1850s. Church leaders had begun to notice a pattern of disappearances and quietly launched their own investigation, led by Brigham Young himself. The crackdown was swift. Known members of the order were excommunicated and forced to leave Utah. Others were reassigned to remote regions where they could be watched, and most of the ritual sites were sealed or destroyed. Jeremiah Blackwood vanished during this purge. Rumors claimed he fled to California, where he continued to gather followers and establish new cells in mining camps and frontier towns, though this was never confirmed. His final message, found carved into stone, was both chilling and defiant, a prophecy that one day the order's holy work would be revealed as divinely inspired, and that true believers would once again be called to prove their faith through blood sacrifice. Elder Tanner's team now understood the full magnitude of what they had uncovered. This was not a single tragedy. It was a systematic conspiracy that had operated for nearly a decade at the very heart of the early Mormon Church, claiming the lives of dozens of innocent people. The implications for the church's reputation and for the faith of millions of members were catastrophic. The tablets even raised a darker question. How much had early church leaders really known about the Order of Eternal Sacrifice, and how long had they allowed it to exist? Some inscriptions hinted that members of the church hierarchy may have been aware of Blackwood's teachings long before the crackdown, but had failed to stop him in time. Even more chilling was a possibility that not all the cells had been destroyed. The tablet suggested that other groups may have continued their rituals in remote settlements, their killings hidden from history. As Elder Tanner prepared his final report, he faced an unbearable choice. Revealing the truth would mean exposing the darkest chapter in Mormon history, risking the faith of millions worldwide. But bearing the truth meant condemning Sarah, Rebecca, Mary, Ruth, and possibly hundreds of other victims to permanent silence. The choice ultimately fell to the highest authorities of the church. On November 15, 1920, in the private chambers of the First Presidency, Elder Tanner presented his 3-hour report to President Heber J. Grant, his counselors, and a quorum of the 12 apostles. According to those present, it was one of the most sobering meetings in church history. The decision was swift. The evidence would be preserved, but sealed in the church's most secure archives, accessible only to the highest leaders. The victims would be remembered in quiet, private memorials, but the public would never know the truth. The rationale was clear. Exposing the order would hand ammunition to the church's enemies and risk destroying the faith of ordinary believers. Since the evidence suggested the order had been stamped out decades earlier, there was no longer a public danger, only a potential scandal. The Mill Creek chambers were filled with concrete and sealed forever. The tablets and remains were moved to a hidden vault in Salt Lake City. All witnesses were reassigned or silenced by binding agreements of secrecy. Officially, the construction delay at Mill Creek was blamed on unexpected geological conditions. 6 months later, a new meeting house was completed 3 miles away. The entire story disappeared, buried along with the chamber. But Elder Tanner knew the danger wasn't gone. Some of the tablets contained cryptic references to Western brothers who had carried the order's teachings to mining camps and frontier settlements far beyond church control. President Grant quietly authorized a follow-up investigation, one that would never appear in the church's public records. Over nearly 2 decades, church security agents uncovered 3 more ritual sites, and the most terrifying find of all, a collapsed chamber near Virginia City, Nevada, which had been used as late as 1875. This meant that the Order of Eternal Sacrifice had survived for almost 30 years after its supposed destruction, operating in the shadows, targeting victims in transit mining towns where disappearances went unnoticed. To prevent further killings and to avoid federal involvement that could expose everything, the church created a covert program to seek out and dismantle any remaining cells of the order. For nearly 20 years, this secret operation hunted the last of Jeremiah Blackwood's followers. And yet, the records leave one final, haunting question unanswered. Was the Order of Eternal Sacrifice truly destroyed, or does it still exist, waiting for the appointed time Blackwood prophesied, when the blood rituals will begin again? The church's covert program worked in silence, tracking suspected members of the order, gathering evidence, and giving them a stark choice: abandon their rituals or disappear from positions where they could do harm. Over time, the program uncovered and dismantled 6 remaining order cells, but what they found painted a horrifying picture. The Order of Eternal Sacrifice had operated in at least 15 locations across the western United States, claiming over 200 victims between 1847 and 1875. The final cell was destroyed in 1895, when church agents tracked down Jeremiah Blackwood himself, now an old man living under a false name in a remote Colorado mining camp. Even in his 70s, Blackwood had continued his twisted mission, recruiting followers and overseeing at least 12 more ritual killings in the previous decade. His capture and the seizure of his extensive records finally ended the order as an active threat, but it also gave the church its first complete picture of conspiracy. The records revealed an organization far more structured, far more influential, and far more dangerous than anyone had imagined. They even showed links to other fringe religious movements, suggesting Blackwood's ideas had seeped far beyond Utah. The campaign against the order was never acknowledged publicly. Most church members lived and died, never knowing such a conspiracy had existed. The victims were honored only in private ceremonies, their names entered into secret memorial records that praised their sacrifice while hiding the truth of their deaths. Elder Tanner continued to serve with distinction and carried the burden of this terrible knowledge to his grave at the age of 93. In his sealed papers, discovered after his death in 1963, he left only a single cryptic note: "The most difficult investigation of my life. May the victims of extreme faith find the peace they sought through such terrible means." The stone chambers beneath Mill Creek remain sealed to this day, their content preserved as a silent witness to one of the darkest chapters in American religious history. The truth about Ezekiel Whitmore and his 4 wives, along with the hundreds of others who died at the hands of the order, still lies locked away in the church's most secure archives, known only to a handful of senior leaders. From time to time, there are debates about whether the secret should finally be made public. Each time, the conclusion is the same: the potential harm is too great. The names of the victims remain officially listed as pioneers who departed for unknown destinations, their true fate erased by more than a century of institutional secrecy. Today, Mill Creek is a peaceful suburban neighborhood, full of homes, schools, and modern churches. Few residents know they live above what was once a site of ritual murder, where dozens of people were slain in the name of eternal glory. The winter of 1847 to 1848, when 4 women vanished without leaving footprints in the snow, remains one of the most carefully guarded secrets in Mormon history. Whether that secret will ever be revealed or stay buried forever is a question for future generations of church leaders. But the story of Ezekiel Whitmore and his wives stands as a chilling warning of what happens when faith is twisted into fanaticism, and when the pursuit of salvation becomes a justification for the destruction of innocent lives. And just when we think we know everything about the order of eternal sacrifice, new questions always seem to rise from the shadows. If this story gave you chills, imagine what other secrets are still hidden in America's religious history. Hit that like button if you think some truths are too dark to reveal, and subscribe to join our community of seekers willing to explore the darkest mysteries of the past. What do you think? Should the Mormon Church reveal the full truth about the order, or are some secrets better left buried? Share this video with someone who can handle these revelations, and tell me in the comments which mysteries you want us to uncover next, because the truth is still out there, waiting for those brave enough to find it.